The Sydney Tramway network once served Sydney, the capital city of New South Wales, Australia. In its heyday, it was the largest in Australia, the second largest in the Commonwealth of Nations, and one of the largest in the world. The network was heavily worked, with about 1,600 cars in service at any one time at its peak during the 1930s. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, an average of more than one tram journey per day was made in Sydney by every man and woman, infant and child in the city. Patronage peaked in 1945 at 405 million passenger journeys. The system was in place from 1879 until its winding down in the 1950s and closure in 1961. It had a maximum street mileage of 181 miles, in 1923. History Early tramways Sydney's first tram was horse-drawn, running from the old Sydney railway station to Circular Quay along Pitt Street. Built in 1861, the design was compromised by the desire to haul railway freight wagons along the line to supply city businesses, in addition to passenger traffic. This resulted in a track that protruded from the road surface and damaged the wheels of wagons trying to cross it. Hard campaigning by competing omnibus owners as well as a fatal accident involving the leading Australian musician Isaac Nathan in 1864 led to closure in 1866. In 1879 a steam tramway was established. Despite several accidents, it was a great success and the system expanded rapidly through the city and inner suburbs. The steam motor trams comprised a Baldwin locomotive hauling one or more double-deck carriages. A preserved Baldwin steam motor tram is at the Powerhouse Museum Discovery Centre at Castle Hill, and there is an operational steam motor and trailer set at the Valley Heights Steam Tramway Museum, in the Blue Mountains near Sydney. Another is at MOTAT, Auckland. There were also two cable tram routes, to Ocean Street and in North Sydney, later extended to Crow's Nest, because of the steep terrain involved. Additionally, horse trams operated between Newtown and St Peters railway stations in the 1890s and between Manly and North Manly from 1903 to 1907. These two instances were replacements of existing steam trams during periods of low patronage. Electrification The Sydney tram power supply system was built using New York subway electrical equipment that was adapted for tram usage. Generating plant was installed at Ultimo and White Bay power stations. Electrification started in 1898, and most of the system was converted by 1910. The privately owned Parramatta line built by Charles Edward Janneret in 1881 to Red Bank Wharf steam tram remained until 1943. Service began with C-class saloon cars, followed by D-class combination cars. In contrast to other cities that started with combination cars and toast tracks, then quickly abandoned them for drop center and saloon cars, Sydney started by going the other way. Football trams continued to be introduced, notably E-class, K-class, and the double bogie cars. O-class and P-class trams required the conductor to collect fares from the footboard of the car, as those trams had no corridor. Revered though those trams were, they were death traps for conductors. On average, each day one conductor fell or was knocked off the footboard by passing motor vehicles. The majority suffered a fractured skull. In the 3 years 1923, 1924, 1925, there were 282, 289, and 233 accidents respectively to conductors on NSW tramways. From 1916 to 1932, there were 97 accidents to tram employees, and from 1923 to 1931 there were 10,228 accidents to passengers having falls when alighting or boarding. 63 of the falls were fatal. Of the more than 100 falls reported of conductors, 1/4 died from their injuries. It was not until the 1930s with the introduction of the R-class that the drop-centre saloon tram, widely used elsewhere in Australia, came to Sydney. Even so, football trams continued in wide use until the late 1950s, despite calls as early as 1934 by the tram union for them to be modified. Demise and closure by the 1920s, the system had reached its maximum extent. In many ways, the Sydney tram system was a victim of its own success. The overcrowded and heaving trams running at a high frequency, in competition with growing private motor car and bus use, created congestion. Competition from the private car, private bus operators and the perception of traffic congestion led to the gradual closure of lines from the late 1930s. Overseas transport experts were called upon to advise the city on its post-war transport issues and recommended closure of the system. Closure was supported by the NRMA, but generally went against public opinion. Nevertheless, closure became Labour government policy and the system was wound down in stages, with withdrawal of the last service, to La Fraus, in 1961, which was driven by Jerry Valk, a Czechoslovak man from Annandale. City service Circular Quay Euro Railway Central Station Colonnade . This was an extremely busy service for passengers transferring from suburban trains at Central, particularly prior to the opening of the City Underground Railway lines in 1926. Trams operated from Central Station down Castlereagh Street to Circular Quay and back up Pitt Street in a large anti-clockwise loop. These tracks were also used as the city route for some eastern and southwestern routes during busy periods. The line made use of the sandstone viaduct onto the colonnade at Central Station, and is used again today by trams of sort, in the form of the Inner West Light Rail Sistema Euro, but in the opposite direction. Eastern Suburbs lines. Circular Quay was the focal terminal point of most services to the eastern suburbs, and allowed easy transfer to ferries. For many years, 27 regular services operated from Circular Quay. A number of full-time services also operated from a secondary terminus at Railway. Watson's Bay Line . This line started with a loop at the corner of Erskine and Day Streets near Wynyard Station, then proceeded south down Day Street, turning left into King Street. It then proceeded down King Street, crossing 4 other busy lines. It then passed through Queen's Square at St James Station, then swung right into College Street, heading south past St Mary's Cathedral, then turning left into Boomerang Street. The line then swung left into William Street and proceeded down William Street to King's Cross, before heading into Bayswater Road. The line then ran east along Bayswater Road, then into New South Head Road at Rushcutters Bay. The Rushcutters Bay tram depot, which served this line, was located at this point, on the north side of the road. The line then followed the course of New South Head Road through Double Bay, Rose Bay and Vaucluse. A single track then passed through narrow rock cuttings, low cliffs and rugged backdrops, twisting and turning its way down to the terminus at Watson's Bay. The line reached Edgecliff in 1894, and Watson's Bay in 1909. In 1949 the line from Rose Bay to Watson's Bay closed, but reopened in 1950 due to public protest. In 1950, the line down King Street to Erskine Street closed and a new terminus constructed at Queen Square. The remainder of the line closed in 1960. This line had its own depot and city terminus and operated independently, although was connected to the main system. The tram line followed the present-day route of buses 324 and L24. Woolloomooloo Line . This line branched off from Park Street and ran north along Hague Avenue, Sir John Young Crescent and Lincoln Crescent to Brown's Wharf at Woolloomooloo. Through service ran from Circular Quay via Elizabeth and Park Streets. The line opened in stages between 1915 and 1918. The line was an early closure, in 1935, being replaced by a bus service from Pyrmont. North Bondi via Bondi Junction Line . Services operated from either Circular Quay or Railway Square, to Oxford Street. The line then passed down Oxford Street to Bondi Junction, where it branched off from Bronte services, to run down Bondi Road to Fletcher Street, Campbell Parade and then to the North Bondi tram terminus. A feature of this line was the large 3-track terminus cut into a hillside at North Bondi, which opened in 1946. The line opened in 1884 as a steam tramway to Bondi, then to Bondi Beach in 1894. Electric services commenced in 1902. The line closed in 1960. The tram line followed the current route of bus 380 as far as North Bondi. North Bondi via Paddington and Bellevue Hill line . Heading south down Elizabeth Street from Circular Quay, the line turned left into Park Street, then wound through East Sydney via a right turn into Yurong Street, a left turn into Stanley Street, a right turn into Book Street, then a left turn into Burton Street. According to plans held in the archives of the City of Sydney, a spur line existed linking Burton Street to the prisoners' entrance on Forbes Street at the rear of the Darlinghurst Courthouse. This may have allowed prisoners from Long Bay Jail or elsewhere to be transported by tram to Darlinghurst Courthouse, East Sydney Technical College, Court and Old Jail. January 1, 1933. January 1, 1933. Archives of City of Sydney. http Tools City of Sydney nsw.gov or entity ASPX. Path equals /item /4011. FA feature was the tram-only viaduct over Barcombe Avenue and Boundary Street in Darlinghurst as the line headed into McDonald Street. This viaduct is now a road bridge. The line then twisted down Glenmore, Gurner and Hargrave Streets in Paddington, then Moncur and Queen Streets in Woollahra. Here, a connection to Oxford Street allowed access to the Waverley Depot. The line then travelled down Edgecliff and Victoria Roads, then wound along Birriga Road in Belleville Hill, finally running down Curlewis Street and Bondi to join the Bondi Beach via Bondi Junction line on Campbell Parade, to the North Bondi terminus. The line was double-track throughout with numerous points to allow short working. Services operated from Circular Quay via Elizabeth Street and Park Street. The line opened to Belleville Hill in 1909, and to Bondi Beach in 1914. The line was cut back to Oceans Street, Woollahra in 1955. The remainder closed on June 27, 1959. The line followed approximately the current route of bus 389 between the city and Woollahra and route X84 between Woollahra and Bondi Beach. Bronte Line . This line branched from the North Bondi via Bondi Junction line at Bondi Junction, running down Bronte Road and Macpherson Street to Bronte Beach. A feature of this line was the final approach to Bronte Beach in a rock cutting parallel to the Pacific Ocean. The line opened to Waverley in 1890, then to Bronte in 1911. Electric services started to Waverley in 1902, then Bronte in 1911. Through services ran from Circular Quay or Railway Square. The line was closed in 1960 and replaced by a bus service that follows the current route of bus 378. Clovelly Line . This line branched from Anzac Parade at Allison Road, and ran on its own tram reservation beside Centennial Park as far as Darley Road. Here it diverged from services to Coget, to run north along Darley Road, then turned right into Clovelly Road to run down to its terminus at Clovelly Beach. The line opened from Allison Road to the intersection of Clovelly and Carrington Roads in 1912, then to Clovelly in 1913. Those services ran from Circular Quay and from Railway Square. The line closed in 1957. The tram line followed the current route of bus 339. Coget Line . The line branched from the line to Clovelly at Darley Road in Randwick. It ran down King Street beside the Randwick Tramway Workshops, then ran in its own reservation to Belmer Road. It then ran down Friars Road, St Paul Street, Carr Street and Arden Street before terminating in a balloon loop and Dolphins Street, Coget Beach. It ran through several small tram reservations on its way down from Randwick to the beach. The line from Randwick to Coget opened in 1883, and electric services were introduced in 1902. The line closed in 1960. It follows the current route of bus 373. Lafrau's Line . This line branched from Oxford Street at Taylor Square in Darlinghurst to run south along Flinders Street, then into its own tram reservation along the eastern side of Anzac Parade beside Moore Park. It then proceeded down the centre of Anzac Parade through Marlborough Junction, and Malabar to its balloon loop terminus at Lafrau's. At Malabar a single line branched off to serve Long Bay Jail. The line was double-track throughout. In 1934 the fourth section of the Lafrau's tramline was built to Bunnerong Power Station in Matraville to encourage residential and industrial growth in the area. The line reached Loughborough in stages from 1900 to 1902. It was the final line to close in 1961. The line followed the current route of bus 394. Marlborough Line This line branched off the line to Loughborough at the intersection of Anzac Parade and Marlborough Road, travelling east along Marlborough Road, Cooper Street, French Street and Mons Avenue before terminating in a balloon loop in Marine Parade, Marlborough Bay Beach. The line was double-track throughout, and passed through several tram reservations on its descent down to the beach. Direct services operated from Circular Quay and Railway Square. The line opened from Anzac Parade to Marlborough Bay in 1921, and closed in 1961. The line followed the current route of bus 397. Cross Country Line This line branched off Bronte Road at Waverley and travelled south down Albion Street and Frenchman's Road, then via Francis and Cook Streets to join the Coger line at Belmar Road in Randwick. The line was single-track throughout, with a passing loop on Frenchman's Road. Initially services ran from the junction at Albion Street in Waverley to Randwick only, this was later extended to Coger in 1907. From 1910, through services operated from Bondi Beach to Coger Beach, and later additionally from Waverley Depot to Coger Beach. The line opened as a steam tramway in 1887, and was electrified in 1902. It closed in 1954, replaced by the 313 bus. West Kensington via Surrey Hills Line This line branched from the tram lines in Oxford Street and ran down Crown Street to Cleveland Street in Surrey Hills, then south along Baptist Street to Phillip Street, where it swung left into Crescent Street before running south along Dowling Street. It passed the Dowling Street depot, then tuned left into Todman Avenue where it terminated at West Kensington. Services operated full-time from Circular Quay, and to Railway in peak hours. The line opened in 1881 down Crown Street as far as Cleveland Street as a steam tramway. It was extended to Phillip Street in 1909, Todman Avenue in 1912, and then to its final terminus down Todman Avenue in 1937. The line down Crown Street closed in 1957, the remainder stayed open until 1961 to allow access to the Dowling Street depot. Sydney buses route 301, 302 and 303 generally follow the route down Crown and Baptist Streets as far as Phillip Street. Botany via Railway Square Line Route, services operated from Circular Quay initially via Elizabeth, Chalmers and Redfern Streets, then in 1933 via Pitt and Castlereagh Streets, and Eddy Avenue, Lee and Regent Streets, to Botany Street in Waterloo. A single-track connection along Book and Odio Streets joined at the present-day Green Square, allowing access to the Dowling Street depot. The line then passed down the entire length of Botany Road to Botany. In Mascot, a branch led to the former Ascot Racecourse at the side of Sydney Airport. Points were provided at Bay Street on Botany Road in Botany for short working. The line was double-track throughout. From Botany, a single-track line crossed the Botany Goods Railway at Beecham Road, then passed along Perry Street and Bunnerong Road, past the former Bunnerong Power Station to join the Loughborough line at Yarra Junction. Generally a shuttle service operated on this single-track section between Botany and Loughborough. This single-track line was cut back to Military Road in 1935. The line opened in 1882 as a steam tramway to Botany, and electric services commenced in 1903. The line from the junctions at Cleveland Street to Botany closed in approximately 1956/57. Sydney buses route 309 generally follows the route. Alexandria Line This line branched from the Botany line at the junction of Henderson and Botany Roads in Alexandria. The line proceeded down Erskineval Oval for short working. The line turned right into the present-day Sydney Park Road before terminating at the junction with the Cooks River Line at the Princes Highway near St Peter's Railway Station. Services operated from Circular Quay in a route similar to the Botany line as far as the Henderson Road junction. The line opened in 1902 as a single-track electric line, duplicated in 1910. It was closed in 1959. Sydney buses route 308 generally follows the route as far as St Peter's Station. Henderson Road Line equals. This short line branched from the Alexandria Line tracks at the corner of Henderson and Mitchell Roads in Alexandria and passed along Henderson Road to Park Street in Erskineville, and later to Bridge Street adjacent to Erskineville Railway Station. Services operated from Circular Quay. The line was an electrified single track throughout. The line opened to Park Street in 1906 and to Bridge Street in 1909. The line was an early closure, in 1933. It was replaced by a private bus service that no longer operates. Rosebery Line equals. This line opened in 1902 initially via Chalmers and Redfern Streets and south along Elizabeth Street to Zetland via Elizabeth Street. In 1924, the line was extended to Epsom Road in Rosebery. In 1948, to facilitate construction of the Eastern Suburbs Railway, a new line was constructed down Elizabeth Street between Devonshire Street and Redfern Street and the route was deviated to run down this new section. The line was electrified double-track throughout. The line was closed in 1957. Dasseyville Line equals. This line branched from the Botany Road line at Gardners Road, and passed east along Gardners Road to join the lines at Anzac Parade at what was known as Dasseyville Junction. It included a large collection of sidings at the former Rosebery Racecourse, now the site of the Lakes Golf Course. The full line opened in 1913, with services from Circular Quay via Waterloo. Some services were extended to Marlborough Beach via the Anzac PDE lines. The line closed in 1957. Western Lines. The majority of services operated from Fort Macquarie and Circular Quay down George Street to various destinations. In the peak hours and other busy periods, supplementary services operated from Railway Square. The 1920s were seen as a boom period. With up to 200 trams in use on lines to Leichhardt, Drumwan, Ryde, Abbotsford, Glebe and Balmain on a daily basis. The tram lines to Glebe Point, Balmain, Lilyfield, Leichhardt and Haberfield were closed in November 1958. Leichhardt, Abbotsford and 5 Dock equals. Trams also service Leichhardt via Parramatta Road and Norton Street, turning right onto Perry Street and then onto Balmain Road where it joined Darling Street. The terminus was located adjacent to the Rozelle Primary School. It was possible to change trams and connect with ferry services at the Darling Street Wharf. The Abbotsford line branched off the Leichhardt line at Marions Street, Leichhardt. The line followed Marions Street, Ramsay Street, Haberfield, and then turned right onto Great North Road, travelling through 5 Dock and Abbotsford before terminating near the terrace and connecting with ferry services at Abbotsford Wharf. The line was closed between 5 Dock and Abbotsford in 1954, Haberfield and 5 Dock in 1956, and closed to Haberfield in 1958. Lilyfield equals. The Lilyfield line branched off the Balmain line at Epping Junction and then went via Reserve Track to Taylor Street and then right into Booth Street, Annandale. The tram line turned right into Catherine Street and terminated at the intersection of Abattoir Road and Grove Street, on the bridge over the railway goods yard. This was the only tram terminus in Sydney located on a bridge. The Lilyfield line was closed in November 1958. Balmain equals. The first steam tram to service Darling Street was in 1892. 10 years later the service was electrified. A feature of this line was a counterweight dummy system that controlled and assisted trams on a steep single-line section of track near the terminus at Darling Street Wharf. Due to the very steep incline at the bottom of the street, the trams used a complex dummy counterweight system constructed under the road surface. The trams were assisted up the steep hill by the dummy, and were retarded by the dummy on the way down to safely descend the hill. Circular Quay to Balmain tram services terminated at Gladstone Park for most of the life of the system. Darling Street Wharf was the terminus for the cross-suburban route to Canterbury. The Canterbury-Darling Street Wharf service was closed in 1954. Until 1955, City to Balmain services were extended to the wharf, when buses replaced trams between Gladstone Park and the wharf. Balmain services were closed with other Western Line services in November 1958. Birchgrove equals. Services branched off from the main line on Darling Street, turning left into Rowntree Street, then another left into Cameron Street, before turning right into Grove Street and terminating at Wharf Road, Birchgrove. This route follows the contemporary 441 bus route. Service to Birchgrove was terminated in 1954. Glebe Point this line travelling from the city branched off onto Glebe Point Road from Parramatta Road, terminating near the corner of Pendrell Street. Tram1 and Ryde Ryde services ran the full length of George Street and turned into Harris Street just after Railway Square following the same route as the later 501 bus service. Trams went along Harris Street and crossed the Glebe Island Bridge. From White Bay Junction until the Darling Street Junction, Ryde trams shared tracks in Victoria Road with the Balmain and Birchgrove lines. The tram then crossed the Iron Cove Bridge and the former Gladesville Bridge before turning right onto Blacksland Road. It then wound its way along Blacksland Road, behind the site of the current council chambers, terminating near the intersection of Pope and Devlin Street in Ryde. There was a peak-hour service to Drumwan via Forest Lodge. At Forest Lodge the line swung right into Ross Street before entering onto its own reserve track, now known as Minnow Crescent, passing Rozelle Tram Depot. This joined the main Victoria Road Ryde line at White Bay Junction. It was initially a single line, later duplicated from Rozelle to Ryde between 1906 and 1936. The tram terminus was established at the western end of Blacksland Road, located near the current Top Ryde City Shopping Centre, and extended down Victoria Road through Gladesville, where it eventually terminated at Fort Macquarie. The entire trip took approximately 61 minutes to complete, and was the single longest route on the Sydney tram network, measuring 10 miles 61 chains via Pyrmont. In 1914 a single tram line was added between Ryde Post Office and West Ryde Railway Station. The Sydney to Ryde service became very popular, particularly at weekends when Sydney residents would travel to the orchards of the Ryde district to buy produce. The tram service from Ryde to the city was cut back to Drumwan on January 19, 1949 and replaced by buses. The service to Drumwan was terminated in 1953. Balmain via Pyrmont services commenced at Railway Square, travelling southwest on Broadway, turning right onto Harris Street, passing the former Darling Harbour Goods Yard. At Pyrmont a separate line branched off from the main line on Harris Street, turning left into Miller Street, turning right into Bank Street, crossing the former Glebe Island Bridge. It then travelled along Commercial Road turning right onto Victoria Road, then right onto Darling Street, terminating at the Darling Street Wharf. Annandale and Forest Lodge lines ran along Booth Street, Parramatta Road, Ross Street, St John's Road, Mount Vernon Street and Catherine's Street, as well as Taylor Street. Current bus route 470 follows this tram line. Southwestern Lines. The Southwestern group of lines branched off Broadway at City Road in Camperdown, and passed along King Street through Newtown. 4 lines then proceeded to Cooks River, Dulwich Hill, Canterbury and Earlwood. A short-lived line also operated between Canterbury and Summer Hill. Cooks River Line this line ran southwest along City Road from Broadway, then along King Street, Newtown, past Newtown and St Peter's railway stations to the Princes Highway. It then proceeded down the Princes Highway to its terminus at the Cooks River. At Tempe, a connection lead to the Tempe Depot, on the corner of Princes Highway and Gannons Street. Past the terminus at the Cooks River, a single line led over the river to the Wally Creek Perway Yard. The line reached St Peter's as a steam tramway in 1891, then to Cooks River in 1900 when electric services commenced. The line closed in 1957, and bus 422 parallels the former line. Dulwich Hill Line this line branched from the line to Cooks River at Newtown, and travelled down Enmore Road through Enmore, then along Victoria Road to Marrickville Road before tuning right along Marrickville Road through Marrickville and Dulwich Hill to New Canterbury Road. At the New Canterbury Road terminus, a tram turning loop was provided. This is currently used as a layover area for buses. Current bus route 426 follows this tram line. equals Canterbury Line a Euro Darling Street Wharf equals a cross-country connection between the Canterbury Line at New Canterbury Road to Petersham and the Western Suburbs lines on Parramatta Road allowed a cross-country service to operate between Canterbury and Balmain. From Crystal Street, Fort Street, Parramatta Road, this route continued via Norton Street Leichhardt to Balmain Road Rozelle where it crossed Victoria Road, then Darling Street Wharf, East Balmain, to reach the wharf itself with the help of the famous counterweight. It now forms the basis of the 444 and 445 bus routes. From Circular Quay trams reached Newtown via Cataleria Street Broadway, City Road, King Street, then headed south on Enma Road. The tram turned right into Addison Road, before turning right into Livingston Road and then left onto New Canterbury Road in Petersham. The line then travelled down New Canterbury Road through Dulwich Hill and Hurlstone Park to a terminus adjacent to Canterbury Railway Station in Broughton Street. The bus route 428 follows the route of this line. Earlwood Line equals, this line branched from the line to Dulwich Hill at Illawarra Road at Marrickville Road. It travelled southwest along Illawarra Road, crossing the Cooks River, followed by a steep ascent up Homer Street to the Earlwood shopping district. The line terminated in Homer Street at the intersection of William Street and Hartlepool Avenue. Current bus route 423 follows the former tram line, although this bus route now extends to Kingsgrove. Cooks Rivera Euro Dulwich Hill Line equals, a cross-country line connected the Cooks River Line and the Dulwich Hill Line via Sydenham, operating along Railway Road and Sydenham Road in Sydenham. A cross-country service operated between Cooks River and Dulwich Hill. Hurlstone Park a Euro Summer Hill Line equals, a short-lived single-track line operated from the Canterbury Line at Hurlstone Park along Old Canterbury Road and Prospect Road to Summerhill Railway Station. Services operated between Canterbury and Summerhill from 1915. However, low patronage and competition from motor buses saw the line close in 1933. The disused track and overhead remained in place until the 1950s. This line was in use in the early 1950s. There were double tracks opposite Trinity Grammar School and Prospect Road. Erskineville Line equals, this line branched from tracks at Regent Street and Chippendale, and passed west along Mower Street, then south into Abercrombie Street. It followed Abercrombie Street south across the junction with Cleveland Street through Golden Grove, before swinging south into Golden Grove Street then right into Wilson Street. The line then passed under the railway lines at Burrans Street, adjacent to the entrance to McDonald Town Railway Station. The line then became a single-track loop passing up Burrans Street to Erskineville Road, then west along Erskineville Road to Septimus Street, then Albert Street before rejoining the tracks at Burrans Street. Services operated from Circular Quay using the Pitt and Castlereagh Streets lines. The line opened as an electric double-track tramway in 1909. The line south of Cleveland Street closed in 1940, with the northern section used by other services until its closure in 1958. Southern Suburbs lines, the following lines were all isolated from the main system. Rockdale to Brighton Les Sands Line equals. This line opened as a private steam tramway in 1885. It was electrified in 1900, and moved into government ownership in 1914. The line connected with the trains at Rockdale Station, then passed down Bay Street to Brighton Les Sands. The line was single-track throughout, with a passing loop at each end. The line closed in 1949 and was replaced by a bus service. A small depot in Rockdale maintained the cars. Garra to Sanssouci Line equals. This steam tramway opened in 1887 using small railway locomotives and carriages. In 1891 two conventional steam tram motors were built for the line by Henry Vail. 6 C1 type trailers replaced the railway carriages around the same period. The tramway operated for 50 years until it was replaced by an electric trolley bus service in 1937. It connected with trains at Garra Station by way of a large balloon loop through the streets, then passed south down Rocky Point Road to Sanssouci, Sandringham and Dolls Point. Small depots at Sandringham and Garra serviced the line. The line was single track at each end with a double track middle section down Rocky Point Road. Track on the line was laid to railway standards to allow railway trucks to haul goods over the line. Wilson's 1917 map shows the route leaving Garra Station, then Grey Street, across Garra Road, and thence by road to Rocky Point Road, entering near Hermans Street, thence along Russell Avenue, Clarville Street to the foreshore, then along the foreshore to Sansasai Rocky Point Road, then north along that road, rejoining the line at Russell Avenue. Ann Cliff to Bexley Line this steam tramway opened in 1909 and closed in 1926. It connected with trains at Arncliffe Station, and ran down Wollongong Road, then Forest Road through Bexley before terminating at the corner of Forest and Prids Roads, Bexley. The line was single-track, with a passing loop midway. A small car shed at Arncliffe maintained the trams. Sutherland to Cronulla Line this line opened as a steam tramway between Sutherland Railway Station and Cronulla's Shelley Beach, in 1911. It closed to passengers and was replaced by a bus service in 1931, and closed completely in 1932. It predated the Sutherland to Cronulla branch of the Illawarra Line, which took over its role. North Shore Lines. A feature of these lines was the underground tram terminus at Wynyard Railway Station, and the tracks over the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Trams ran from Blue Street, North Sydney over a now demolished steel arch bridge over the Harbour Bridge roadway, then over the eastern side of the Harbour Bridge, through a tram platform at Milson's Point similar to the existing railway station, and dived underground into platforms 1 and 2 of Wynyard Station. These platforms were converted into a car park after the tramway's closure in 1958. Wynyard Station's railway platforms are thus numbered 3 to 6. The line along Military Road, opened in September, 1893, was the first permanent electric tramway in Sydney and New South Wales. The first part of the North Sydney tramway system was a double-track cable tramway which started at the original Milson's Point Ferry Wharf, located where the north pylon of the Harbour Bridge is now. The line originally extended via Alfred Street, Junction Street, Blue Street and Miller Streets to the winding engine house and depot at Ridge Street. It used cable grip cars called dummies, and unpowered trailer cars, similar to the large Melbourne cable tramway system but quite different from the surviving lines in San Francisco, where everything is combined in a single vehicle. The original cable line was extended via Miller and Falcon Streets to Crow's Nest, and later the whole line was electrified and extensions were built to various termini around the lower North Shore. The history of the North Sydney tramway system can be divided into 3 periods: the first from the original opening in 1886 to 1909, when the McMahon's Point line opened. The second period covers the time until the Wynyard line was opened across the Sydney Harbour Bridge in 1932, and the third from then until the general closure of the system in 1958. First period 1886 1909 In the initial years of the North Sydney tramways, services operated from Milson's Point Ferry Wharf to Ridge Street Tram Depot was originally a cable tram depot which opened in May 1886. Services were extended to Crow's Nest in July, 1893. Upon conversion to electric operation in February 1900, the depot was extensively rebuilt in 1902 to enlarge the 12-road tram shed. Upon closure in the 1920s, the shed was converted into a cinema, now the Independent Theatre in Ridge Street, North Sydney. Mossman Ferry Wharf opened as an electric line from Miller and Ridge Streets, along Miller Street, Falcon Street, and then Military Road as far as Spit Junction in September 1893 and extended to Mossman Wharf in March 1897. Services initially connected with the cable trams at Ridge Street and shared the cable tracks as far as Miller and Falcon Streets. Chatswood also opened initially as an electric line from Crow's Nest with services connecting with the cable trams at Ridge Street and sharing the cable tracks as far as Crow's Nest. It opened as far as Victoria Avenue, Willoughby in April 1898 and extended to Chatswood Station in July 1908. Through electric services from Milson's Point began when the original cable tramway was electrified in February 1900. Lane Cove a Euro opened as an electric line from Crow's Nest in February, 1900, with trams connecting with other electric services at Ridge Street. It was initially opened as far as Gore Hill and extended to Lane Cove in March 1909. Some through services operated to and from Milsons Point. The Spit a Euro opened from Spit Junction in October 1900. Northbridge a Euro opened from Miller and Falcon Streets as far as Suspension Bridge Cammery in May 1909, to Marana Road Northbridge in February 1914, and to Northbridge Terminus in March 1914. George's Heights a Euro opened from Mossman Junction along Middlehead Road to Cobitty Street in August 1919, for the military hospital, closed beyond the junction with the Balmoral line at Gordon Street in 1925. Balmoral a Euro opened as a branch of the George's Heights line in May, 1922. During this first period, some North Sydney tramway services did not operate to and from Milsons Point. These were, Ridge Street, North Sydney a Euro Taronga Zoo a Euro introduced over the Mossman line, and the new Taronga Zoo line opened in conjunction with the relocation of the zoo from Moore Park to Mossman in October 1916. Neutral Bay Wharf a Euro Neutral Bay Junction a Euro opened in June 1900. This line had a combination of long, steep grades, and only trams fitted with track brakes were permitted to operate this line. Cremorne Wharf the Spit a Euro opened December 1911. Taronga Park Wharf a Euro Balmoral a Euro introduced December 1923. The service operated over the Athol Wharf line, opened in October 1917, the Taronga Zoo line, a new connection in King Max Street, Mossman opened in December 1923, and the George's Heights Balmoral line. Taronga Zoo Gore Hill and Lane Cove and to Chatswood a Euro operated via the Taronga Zoo and Mossman lines, Falcon Street to Crow's Nest, then as for the services from McMahon's Point. Second period 1909 a Euro 1932 in September 1909, a new line was opened from McMahon's Point to Victoria Cross, North Sydney, and a new direct route was opened via what is now the Pacific Highway from Victoria Cross to Crow's Nest. The Milsons Point line was deviated at North Sydney via Walker and Mount Streets to avoid congestion at Victoria Cross. The McMahon's Point line was opened to relieve the load on the Milsons Point Ferry Wharf and connecting tramway. Services to Lane Cove and Chatswood were altered to operate to and from McMahon's Point via the new direct route to Crow's Nest. In conjunction with the construction of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, the Milsons Point line was diverted to a new terminus in Glen Street in July 1924. Escalators were provided to carry tram passengers to the new ferry wharf below. Otherwise, services operated as during the first period. Third period 1932 a Euro 1958 in March 1932 the Sydney Harbour Bridge with its associated railway and tramway tracks was opened, and all of the above services to and from Milsons Point McMahon's Point were diverted to operate to and from Wynyard. The Milsons Point and McMahon's Point lines were then closed. From Wynyard services operated to Lane Cove travelling along the Pacific Highway via Gore Hill, turning left into Longriver Road, terminating near the intersection of Rothwell Avenue, opposite the council chambers. Chatswood turning right off either Falcon Street or the Pacific Highway in Crow's Nest, heading north along Willoughby Road, turning left onto Mowbray followed by a sharp right onto Penshurst Street before turning left on Victoria Avenue, where the line terminated at Chatswood Railway Station, providing passengers with a short interchange between train services. Northbridge a Euro closed beyond Cammery in May 1936 and beyond Falcon Street, North Sydney in January 1948. The Spit and Spit Junction line travelled northeast along Military Road passing through Neutral Bay Junction, Cremorne Junction, and Spit Junction, veering to the left onto Spit Road at Spit Junction, before diverting onto Parrawa Road and terminating near the foot of the Spit Bridge. Balmoral a Euro reduced to limited services outside ferry operating hours following the introduction of the Coordinated Tram Ferry Scheme in May 1952. This scheme was brought in following the government's purchase of Sydney Ferries Limited, and was designed to encourage greater use of ferries. Taronga Park a Euro reduced to limited services outside ferry operating hours as stated in relation to the Wynyard a Euro Balmoral service. All of these lines remained open until the general closure of the North Sydney tramways in June 1958, except for the Northbridge/Suspension Bridge line, and the withdrawal of full-time services from Wynyard to Balmoral and Taronga Zoo as stated above. Cross-country services during this period were Neutral Bay Wharf Neutral Bay Junction closed in May 1956. As mentioned above, this line had a combination of long, steep grades and windy track, and only trams fitted with track brakes or dynamic brakes were permitted. The single track down Hayes Street was the steepest unassisted in Sydney. Cremorne Wharf The Spit The Cremorne Wharf line closed in April 1956. Mossman Wharf Cremorne Junction. The Mossman Wharf line closed in November 1955. Athol Wharf Balmoral. A feature of this line was the steep grade down to the wharf at the terminus. Runaway trams plunged into the harbour in 1942, 1952 and 1958. Taronga Zoo Lane Cove and Chatswood operated via the Taronga Zoo and Military Lines, Falcon Street to Crow's Nest. Then as for the services from Wynyard, services also operated as follows. Balmoral Lane Cove and Chatswood The line from Balmoral opened as a branch of the Georges Heights line in May, 1922 and was one of the last tram lines to be opened in Sydney. It was a difficult route to construct on account of the height above sea level and the short distance to be traversed. Apart from the direct city service to Wynyard via the Sydney Harbour Bridge, cross-regional services ran to Lane Cove, Athol Wharf, Northbridge and Chatswood, making it one of the busiest lines on the North Sydney system. Upon departure from the Esplanade terminus, at the corner of Mandalong Road, trams travelled southeast along the Esplanade. After passing Botanic Road the line swung right onto Henry Plunkett Reserve. From this point the line went off-road and descended uphill onto its own reservation, travelling through a narrow rock cutting, now public walking track. After a steep ascent through the reserve the line crossed several small residential streets along the way, such as Mulbring, Gordon, Plunkett and Beaconsfield Street, before once again entering onto Gordon Street where the line swung right onto Middlehead Road. The tram then joined the main line at the point where Bradley's Head Road, Military Road and Middlehead Road meet. Travelling along Military Road and then Falcon Street, services to Chatswood turned right onto Willoughby Road, and eventually terminated at Chatswood Railway Station, Victoria Avenue Terminus, while services to Lane Cove travelled along the Pacific Highway, terminating at the Lane Cove Council Chambers. Services to Wynyard via North Sydney swung left into Miller Street before crossing the Pacific Highway and entering onto the on-ramp that led to the Steel Arch Bridge that once crossed over Bradfield Highway and thence to the eastern side of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. NB Athol Wharf above refers to the facility now known as Taronga Zoo Wharf, and now referred to as such on bus maps and signs. Manly Lines. The Manly Lines originated on February 14, 1903 with steam motors hauling trailers on a line from Manly to Curl. Passenger traffic fell considerably by autumn that year, and services reverted to horse-drawn trams from July 20, 1903. However, following considerable increase in passengers during the next 4 years, steam trams were returned from October 1, 1907. A line was built to the Spit, and the Manly to Curl line was progressively extended to Brookvale, Collaroy, and Narrabeen. A branch was run to Harbord. Electrification commenced with the construction of the line to the Spit, and was extended throughout the system. The Narrabeen line was also used for carrying freight, for a spur was run to the freight wharf at Manly, and goods sidings were built at Balgala in Sydney Road near Wanganella Street. At Brookvale from a line in Alfred Road short of Federal Parade. And at Narrabeen near King Street. Various track layouts and routes existed in the early days in the vicinity of the Manly terminus, with quite different arrangements existing in 1903, 1911, 1912, and 1914. The routes prior to 1914 used the Corso and Northston, but from 1914 were confined to Belgrave Street. The Manly Lines closed in 1939. The Manly Lines, which were administered by the railways, suffered from maladministration, resulting in considerable overcapitalization of the network, unnecessary rerouting and rebuilding of the track at Manly Terminus. Consequently, the system never made a profit. Rebuilding the terminal at Manly Terminus several times, accompanied by costly property resumption, accounted for huge expenditures with little gain. In 1919 planning began to move slightly the balloon loop at Manly, requiring demolition and rebuilding the Pier Hotel. Rebuilding track in Belgrave Street and the terminus was estimated to cost £5,695, while land resumption including demolition of the Pier Hotel was estimated at £40,000. The hotel was demolished in 1924. The department was slow to provide a speedy service. It persisted in scheduling the long-distance trams behind the all stops. It rejected residents' suggestions to schedule the Narrabeen tram first, and to make the first set-down DY or similar place. For nearly a decade from at least 1923, residents had been asking for faster services to Narrabeen. The trip took 49 minutes. A new timetable was introduced from November 1, 1920, giving a trip time of 39 minutes, but it proved unworkable and the timetable reverted to an old one on July 4, 1921, back to 48 minutes. Residents wanted optional stopping and express running to DY from Manly. The railways ignored those requests, and persisted in running the Narrabeen tram from Manly, behind the all-stops trams to Balgala and Harbord. Finally, when the department moved to schedule Narrabeen trams first, with first set down at DY from November 25, 1931, it took only €33 minutes by tram from Manly to Narrabeen, down from 39 minutes previously, and down from 49 minutes when the service was inaugurated. Manly the Spit this line commenced at the Spit Bridge with a balloon loop. From the balloon loop, in a reservation, the line ascended in a row beside Sydney Road, Heaton Avenue, crossed Ethel Street, still in a row alongside Whittle Street, joining Sydney Road there. At Pacvai Street there was a semi-circular deviation south, out of Sydney Road. At Park Avenue a row took the tram north, then east alongside Raglan's Street, eventually joining Raglan Street at Kangaroo Road. From there, which was a junction for the Narrabeen line, the line turned south, finishing at a large loop at the Esplanade. The Manly to Spit section opened on January 9, 1911. Manly Harbord this line commenced at Manly, proceeded north along Belgrave Street, past the turn-off for the Spit, at Raglan's Street, then along Pittwater Road. Between Queenscliff and Harbord Roads, the line turned into a row, crossed Daly Street, and joined Cavill Street near Lawrence Street. The line turned into Lawrence Street, then proceeded along Albert Street and Moore Road until the terminus at the Esplanade, Freshwater Beach. The single-track branch to Harbord was opened on December 21, 1926. Manly Narrabeen this line commenced at Manly, proceeded north along Belgrave Street, past the turn-off at Raglan Street for the Spit, and onto Pittwater Road. It proceeded past the turn-off to Harbord and continued along Pittwater Road, all the way to Narrabeen at a bridge just north of Waterloo Road. This point was exactly 16 miles from Sydney. The line to Narrabeen opened on December 8, 1913. It was always single-track from Brookvale to Narrabeen Terminus. The line was wired with a catenary overhead, so apparently some high-speed running was anticipated consistent with the light railway legislation for the line. Evidence of the catenary overhead is to be found in photographs in McCarthy's book. Enfield Lines. The Enfield System was a separate group of lines based around a depot in Enfield, in Sydney's inner southwest. The system began as a steam tramway opening in 1891 between Ashfield Station and Enfield. In 1901, this line was extended north to Mortlake, and in 1909 a branch to Cabarita Park was opened. The system was electrified in 1912. Services operated from Ashfield Station along Liverpool Road, Georges River Road, onto a reserved corridor that swung off Georges River Road at a point roughly opposite Windsor Avenue. From this point the corridor ran diagonally towards, then across Burwood Road and onto what is now Tangara Street East. The reserved corridor ended at Portland Street, at which point the line continued west along the length of Tangara Street, then north along what is now Coronation Parade, back to Liverpool Road heading east through Enfield, and then north along Burwood Road through Burwood. The line then turned into Crane Street, then Majors Bay Road and Brewer Street to Cabaretta Junction. The line was double-track until this point, then it split into single-track branches to Mortlake via Frederick, Vanney and Gale Streets and Tennyson Road, and to Cabaretta via Cabaretta Road. Short services were turned back at Brighton Avenue, Plymouth Street, Enfield, Burwood Station and Wellbank Street. Services operated every 5 minutes between Ashfield and Wellbank Street in peak periods, and every 15 minutes on the two branches. A depot on Tangara Street, near Kembla Street and Coronation Parade, served the lines. The lines closed in 1948, and were replaced by buses. Tramway infrastructure was removed throughout the route in 1951. The Tangara Street depot was used by buses until its closure in 1989. The depot was demolished to make way for housing. A small brick hut used as a waiting room for passengers still stands on the western side of the Coronation Parade Reserve near Deans Street. This is one of very few surviving remnants of the line. The reserved tramway corridor at Croydon Park is now residential property from its eastern limit starting at Georges River Road opposite Windsor Avenue and running diagonally to Burwood Road, and also from Burwood Road to Tangara Street East. Tangara Street East, which did not exist in the days of tram operation, follows the route of the remainder of the corridor to its western limit at the intersection with Portland Street. Castle Hill Line. A steam tramway opened between Parramatta and Borkham Hills in 1902, and was extended to Castle Hill in 1910, carrying passengers and produce to and from the area. This tramway departed at Argyle Street in Parramatta and tracked north along Church Street to Northmead, then along Windsor Road and Old Northern Road to Castle Hill. In 1919, the NSW government decided to convert the tramway into a railway to encourage the subdivision of estates for residential use. The railway line was extended to Rogans Hill in 1924. The line proved to be unsuccessful and was closed on January 31, 1932. Rolling stock. In 1905 a general alphabetical classification was introduced to the NSW government tramways. Generally the letters A and B were given to steam stock with letters C and higher to electric cars based on seating capacity. Perhaps the most renowned of the electric trams that operated in Sydney were the O and P class trams, known at the time as the footboard cars, after the surrounding footboard that conductors precariously balanced upon. These were later known as toe-track trams for their crossbench wooden seating layout. They had a seating capacity of 80 and a crush capacity of 150, and it was this capacity that was their selling point for Sydney's crowded system. They were commonly coupled together to run as double trams. 626 O-class and 258 P-class trams were constructed from 1908, and some remained in service until 1960. The first modern corridor-style trams, the R-class, were introduced in 1933. The final order of cars was for the R1 class in the early 1950s. The R-class were unable to be coupled together. The R-series offered their passengers a more comfortable ride away from the elements, and featured mostly upholstered seating. Some of these cars had not been in service long enough for a major overhaul before their withdrawal in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Upon withdrawal, most cars were stripped of their metal components and bogies, then burnt in an area of the Randwick Tramway workshops known as Burning Hill. Some were sold as stripped shells to private users to be used as shelters, storage shed, etc. Some were preserved, mostly at Sydney Tramway Museum at Loftus. Accidents. On August 21, 1924, a coupled set of E-class cars ran out of control near McMahon's Point, derailed and crashed into a house. There were 2 fatalities, and the trams were extensively damaged. In 1929, a P-class tram crashed into a barber's shop on the corner of Quay and Ultima Roads near Central Station. Almost half of the tram car ended up in the shop. There were accidents at Athol Wharf, Taronga Park, when trams lost control running down the steep hill and ended up in the harbour. In 1942, 1952 and 1958. Scores of accidents some fatal befell tram conductors while collecting fares from the footboard of moving trams. Very early trams were enclosed, but those built from the early 1900s had no corridor. These trams included E-Class, K, L, P, and O-Class. Many falls are recorded in the Sydney Morning Herald. The most common injuries included death, head injuries including fractured skull and concussion. Examples of fatal falls are found in the same publication. Workshops. Locomotive workshops were established at King Street, Randwick in 1881 to build and service Sydney's trams. In 1902 the workshops were renamed the Randwick Tramway Workshops. The workshops grew rapidly to become one of Sydney's largest engineering establishments, peaking in around the 1920s. Reduction in Sydney Tramway diminished the tramway workshops' functions and led to its eventual closure in 1960-61. Depots. Dowling Street Depot served the lower eastern suburbs, and inner southern suburbs. The largest tram depot in Australia, it was the last to close in 1961. Now the site of the Moore Park Homemakers Supercentre. Waverley Depot served the Bondi and Bronte routes. Closed in 1959, now the site of a bus depot. Rozelle Depot served the inner western suburbs routes to Leichhardt, Balmain, Birchgrove, Abbotsford and Lilyfield. Closed in 1958, now under redevelopment. Newtown Depot served routes via King Street Newtown to Summerhill, Canterbury, Earlwood, and services to Glebe. Closed in 1957, has been deliberately neglected to the point of collapse. In 2012 the forecourt was converted into a public plaza, providing a new entrance to Newtown Railway Station. North Sydney Depot served the lines via North Sydney. Closed in 1958. The open part was converted into North Sydney Bus Depot, while the car sheds were retained and incorporated into a supermarket. Ultimo Depot served routes to Pyrmont, Ryde, and Erskineville. It was situated on the eastern side of Harris Street adjacent to the Darling Harbour Goods Railway. It closed as a tram depot in 1953, becoming a bus depot, which later closed. Rushcutters Bay Depot served the Watsons Bay Line. Closed in 1960. Fort Macquarie Depot served the Circular Quay Railway service, and services to Woolloomooloo. Closed 1955, now the site of the Sydney Opera House. A large balloon loop encircled the depot, allowing trams to turn around without changing ends. Manly Depot served the isolated Manly lines until closure in 1939. Enfield Depot served the isolated Ashfield-Mortlake/Cabaretta lines. Closed in 1948 and reused as a bus depot until it closed in 1989. Rockdale Depot served the isolated Rockdale-Brighton-Les Sands line. Closed 1949. Tempe Depot served the Cooks River and Marrickville-Dulwich Hill lines. Closed 1954, became a bus depot then closed. Used as a storage facility for withdrawn government buses. Former site of the Sydney Bus Museum before the museum moved to Leichhardt Depot. In 2010 it reopened as a bus depot. Leichhardt Depot was only a storage depot for trams. Served as a bus depot till a new depot was opened next door in 2009. It is now the site of the Bus and Truck Museum. Reminiscence. Number 11 electric C-Class Sydney tram built by Hudson Brothers that went into service on the early electric tram line from Rose Bay to Ocean Street, Woolloomooloo, on August 29, 1898 on static display at Powerhouse Museum, Sydney. On Glebe Point Road a small section of the original tram tracks were uncovered during roadworks in late 2009. The City of Sydney have left these exposed to serve as a historical reminder. A section of uncovered tramway track is on Adair Avenue in Zetland. A single track is visible through the concrete road surface for a few hundred metres. Occasionally other buried sections of the track are exposed when roadworks are carried out. For example, at the intersection of Victoria Avenue and Penshurst Street, Chatswood, extensive tram tracks are visible whenever road resurfacing is carried out. There is a small section of tram track going in both directions on Lower Fort Street Road in Millers Point. There is a small fragment of tram track exposed in the Moore Park grounds near the Sydney Cricket Ground. There is a small fragment of tram track exposed on Old South Head Road, Watson's Bay at the top of Heartbreak Hill. The tracks in Pitt and Castlereagh streets were asphalted over, and were not removed. Several ornate tram shelters still stand, such as at the corner of Park and Elizabeth Streets, City. At North Bondi and Bronte, bus shelters are built into small cuttings that were previously tram stops. Ornamental rosettes located where overhead wiring span wires were attached can be seen on many older buildings and rock faces. There are 7 on a rock wall near the Sydney Opera House at the site of Fort Macquarie Depot. Many street corners where trams turned were cut back to allow space for trams to turn, and subsequently many buildings on such corners still have rounded fronts. The abnormally wide median strip in Anzac Parade south of Kingsford once accommodated tram lines. When walking up the steps to the gap at Watson's Bay, there is flat ground in between 2 sets of steps. This continues for a fair way in both directions, and is the old tram right-of-way. The Ultimo tram sheds are now preserved by the Powerhouse Museum. Tunnel portals to Wynyard from the Sydney Harbour Bridge still exist and can be seen from the pedestrian walkway. Former location of Wynyard tram platforms is now part of the Wynyard Lane car park at the station. Millers Point tram tracks were buried by bitumen when the lines were closed, as the line which comprised the stop at Millers Point where the current buses terminate and return uptown, was dug up around 1979-80 and the tram lines were removed and a new road surface laid. A map of these and other surviving physical remnants has been created. See Sydney Tramway Remnants map in external links below. Legislation. The following acts of the NSW Parliament applied to tramways. This section will be expanded as more acts are added to the online legislation database of the New South Wales Government. In quoting the long title, the names of streets and roads have been left in the form given in the legislation, but modern forms are used in the notes. Pitt Street Tramway Act of 1861 No. 12A, an act for the construction of a tramroad from the Redfern Railway terminus to the semicircular quay. April 30, 1861. A euro only allowed the use of horses or other animals of draught. Pitt Street Tramway Act of 1861 Repeal Act 1866 No. 28A, an act to repeal the Pitt Street Tramway Act of 1861. December 6, 1866. Redfern to Hunter Street Tramway Act of 1879 No. 14A, an act for the construction of a tramroad from the Redfern Railway terminus to Hunter Street, Sydney. May 7, 1879. Authorised the first line of what was to become one of the largest tramways in the world. Consolidated Revenue Fund Act 1879 No. 20A, allocated £11 for the construction the Redfern to Hunter Street line, including rolling stock. Tramways Extension Act 1880 No. 11A, an act to authorise the construction and maintenance of tramways along certain streets and highways in the city and suburbs of Sydney and elsewhere. April 28, 1880. A euro authorised the first parts of what was to become the Bondi Line, as far as Bondi Junction, a branch via Crown and Cleveland Streets to Anzac Parade, the first part of the Coger Line as far as Randwick, the first part of the Bronte Line from Bondi Junction to Charing Cross, the line in George Street from Town Hall to Railway Square, the first part of the Botany Line, the first part of the Canterbury Line, the Glebe Point Line and some other sections that were not built. Jeanneret's Tramway Act, an act to authorise the construction and maintenance of a tramway along George Street, Parramatta, August 9, 1881. Authorised the Parramatta Park Euro Red Bank Wharf Private Steam Tramway, the last steam tramway in Sydney. Appropriation Act of 1883 No. 14A, granted a gratuity of £300 to the widow and 5 children of a tram conductor accidentally killed while on duty. Tramways Declaratory Act 1883 No. 18A, an act to declare legal the employment of steam motors on tramways constructed, worked or maintained in pursuance of the Tramways Extension Act 1880. June 2, 1883. Legalised the use of steam motors on the tramways, such use having been previously declared illegal by the Supreme Court. Sewell's Tramway Act of 1884, an act to authorise the construction and maintenance of a tramway from the proposed Bay Street station on the Illawarra Railway to and along Lady Robinson's Beach. March 6, 1881, Balmain Tramway Act of 1886, an act to authorise the borough of Balmain to contract for the construction and maintenance of tramways within the said borough. July 30, 1886. West Wallsend and Munk Weymouth Railway Act of 1886, an act to enable the West Wallsend Coal Company and the Munk Weymouth Colliery Estate Company of Australia to construct a railway from the West Wallsend coalfields to the Sydney Indirata Railway. August 27, 1880. Sewell's Tramway Act Amendment Act, an act to amend Sewell's Tramway Act of 1884. April 28, 1887. Confirmed the existing loop at Rockdale Station and allowed up to 2 further loops to be built. Willoughby and Gordon Tramway Act of 1887, an act to authorise the construction and maintenance of a tramway from the terminal point of the St Leonards Cable Tramway St Leonards to Forest Reserve No. 97 Parish of Gordon. July 13, 1887. Authorised a private tramway via Miller Street, Palmer Street and Bellevue Street, Cammeray then through private land and across Long Gully, i.e., what became the Northbridge Line. The schedule to the Act describes the route proposed to take the line from Long Gully to East Willoughby. Government Railways Act of 1888 No. 9A, an Act to make better provision for the management of the government railways and tramways of New South Wales and for other purposes connected therewith. May 17, 1888. Replaced the Commissioner for Railways by 3 commissioners, and allowed for a separate railway and tramway construction authority. Public Works Act of 1888 No. 11A, an act to provide for the constitution of an authority to investigate and report upon proposals for public works and the carrying out thereof when authorised by Parliament, to make better provision for the acquisition of land for carrying out such works, and for other purposes in connection therewith. June 6, 1888. Established the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Public Works, to consider and report upon all non-military public works the estimated cost of completing which exceeds £20,000. If approved by the committee, an Act of Parliament had to be passed to authorise the work. Works costing up to £20,000 could be approved by the Governor, that is effectively by the Minister. North Shore, Manly, and Pittwater Tramway and Railway Act of 1888, an act to authorise the construction of a tramway from the northern terminus of the North Shore Cable Tramway to the Spit at Middle Harbour, and from the Spit aforesaid to Manly Village, and a light railway thence to Pittwater, Broken Bay. January 10, 1889. Authorised a private tramway from the end of the Milsons Point to Ridge Street Cable Tramway to Manly, and a light railway from Manly to Pittwater. Appropriation Act of 1889 No. 33A, allocated funds for the expenses of the Royal Commission appointed to inquire into the charge made against Members of Parliament and others in connection with the proposed leasing of the government tramways, Willoughby and Gordon Tramway Act Amending Act, an act to amend the Willoughby and Gordon Tramway Act of 1887. September 17, 1890. Altered the route of the Northbridge Line between Cammeray and the Long Gully Bridge, and authorised its extension to East Willoughby and branches to what was later the Northbridge Terminus, to Middle Cove and an extension of the main line from East Willoughby to Castle Cove. The actual routes into Minia are difficult to identify, because most of the roads named in the schedules to the Act do not exist on modern maps, and may only ever have existed on plans of the various estates. Loan Act of 1890 No. 33A, an act to authorise the raising of a loan for the public service of the colony and for other purposes. December 20, 1890. Allocated 75,000 to be spent on additional rolling stock and to meet expenses of experiments in connection with electric trams, King to Ocean Street Cable Tramway Act of 1892 No. 10A, an act to sanction the construction of a cable tramway from King Street via William Street, in the city of Sydney, to Ocean Street, in the borough of Woollahra. March 16, 1892. Willoughby and Gordon Tramway Acts Amending Act of 1893, an Act to amend the Willoughby and Gordon Tramway Act of 1887, and Willoughby and Gordon Tramway Act Amending Act. February 14, 1893. A euro increased the amount of private land to be taken from a width of 22 feet to 132 feet, again amended the route approaching the south end of Long Gully Bridge, and amended the route of the main line to East Willoughby. George Street and Harris Street Electric Tramway Act 1896 No. 11A, an act to sanction the construction of an electric tramway from Circular Quay, in the city of Sydney, to the Redfern Railway Station, and along Harris Street from its intersection with George Street to its intersection with John Street in the said city. September 14, 1896. Authorised the first permanent electric line forming part of the main system. Loan Act of 1896 No. 33A, an act to authorise the raising of a loan for the public service of the colony, and for other purposes. November 16, 1896. A euro allocated £150,000 for electrification of existing tramways and for electric rolling stock, and £135,000 for construction of the George Street and Pyrmont electric lines. Loan Act of 1897 No. 43, an act to authorise the raising of a loan for the public service of the colony, and for other purposes. December 10, 1897. A euro allocate £20,000 for additions to workshops and buildings, additions to tramway lines and rolling stock, and for other purposes. Public Works Act 1900 No. 26, an act to consolidate the acts relating to public works. September 22, 1900. A euro clarified and consolidated existing legislation. Electric Tramway Act 1900 No. 63, an act to sanction the construction of an electric tramway from Belmore Park through Castle Riad, Bly, and Loftus Streets to Fort Macquarie, returning through Pitt Street, and certain works in connection therewith. And for other purposes. December 5, 1900. Sutherland to Cronulla Tramway Act 1908 No. 16, an act to sanction the construction of a tramway from Sutherland to Cronulla. And for other purposes. December 15, 1908. A euro authorised the original steam tramway to Cronulla, on a different alignment of the present railway. Harris Street to Evans Street, Balmain, Electric Tramway Act 1908 No. 25, an act to sanction the construction of an electric tramway from Harris Street, via Miller Street, Abattoir Road, Glebe Island Bridge, and Western Street to Evans Street, Balmain. And for other purposes. 21 of December, 1908. A euro authorised the connecting line from Pyrmont to Rozelle, via Glebe Island Bridge. The Spitter-Manley Electric Tramway Act 1908 No. 26, an act to sanction the construction of an electric tramway from the Spitter-Manley. And for other purposes. December 21, 1908. Cremorne Tramway Act 1909 No. 12, an act to sanction the construction of an electric tramway from the Military Road, North Sydney, to Cremorne Point. And for other purposes consequent thereon or incidental thereto. December 7, 1909. Darley Road, Randwick, to Little Coget Tramway Act 1910 No. 32, an act to sanction the construction of an electric tramway from Darley Road, Randwick, to Little Coget. And for other purposes. December 28, 1910. A euro authorised what was later known as the Clovelly Line. Tramways Act 1911 No. 22, an act to authorise the carriage of goods upon tramways. To amend the Government Railways Act, 1901. And for purposes incidental thereto. December 21, 1911. A euro authorised the carriage of goods on tramways, except on the George Street and Pitt Castle Riad Streets lines in the city. Transport Administration Act 1988 No. 109, repealed an act, to provide for the administration of public transport in New South Wales. And for other purposes. A euro allows the Director-General of Transport to develop or operate light rail systems, or facilitate their development or operation by other persons. A euro was the legislative basis for the first part of current line from Central Station to Lilyfield, and provides governing law for that line. Transport Administration Amendment Act 1996 No. 128, established the Transport Administration Corporation to set regulations applying to the current line from Central Station to Lilyfield, including extensions. Transport Administration Regulation 2000 Reg 14, repealed declared the route of the extension of the current line from Wentworth Park to Lilyfield. Transport Administration Amendment Act 2003 No. 96, established the Transport Infrastructure Development Corporation. Legacy: the Sydney government bus network generally reflects the area and routes covered by the tram network. Many suburbs with junction in their name reflect their tramway heritage, such as Bondi Junction, Randwick Junction, and Marlborough Junction. The easternmost southbound traffic lanes on the Sydney Harbour Bridge were originally constructed to carry the city and suburban railway but were used for trams, and are still separated from and clearly distinguishable from the other 6 road lanes, with the remnants of the eastern Milsons Point station located at the side of the northern toll plaza. Wynyard Railway Station platforms are still numbered from 3 to 6. Platforms 1 and 2 were tram platforms and the railway platforms were never renumbered when the tram platforms were removed. Shoot through like a Bondi tram is a phrase still used in Sydney, meaning to depart in haste. The Tram Museum is in the suburb of Loftus, in Sydney's south. See also: Light rail in Sydney, trams in Australia, list of light rail transit systems, public transport in Sydney, transportation in Australia, tram controls. Further reading: D. Bardea. Wait here for trams, Sydney's trams, the last decade. Nostalgia Press, March 1974, D. Keenan, Tramways of Sydney. Transit Press, 1979, Railpid Sydney Trams, Action for Public Transport a Sydney Tramways. References. External links, articles on trams and tram deaths in the Dictionary of Sydney, Sydney's Tram History, Sydney Tramway Museum, the current Sydney Light Rail Line, Sydney Tramway Remnants Map linked Ed 270 Tram Pictures and Randwick Council Library enter tram as the keyword, photographs from NSW State Records on FLICKR.